I would like to first begin by identifying the telltale signs of a loss of chromatographic performance and briefly review the other areas of the instrument before we can attribute the problem to the column itself. We will then delve into the underlying causes of column failure, after which we will discuss some performance indicators with which to make a definitive decision about the fate of your column. The first question by which to determine the possible source of a GC problem is whether all peaks within a sample exhibit the same abnormal behavior, or if the undesirable performance is limited to particular analytes within a sample. Be sure to consider the other components of the instrument before passing judgment onto the column itself. We can inspect the following example for the comparison of a new column and a worn-out column. We see tailing and a loss of sensitivity for most peaks, but not necessarily for all of them. The nonpolar hydrocarbons within this particular sample maintain sharp and symmetrical peak shape at their expected retention time. We will discuss the reasons for this bias later during this presentation. Capillary GC columns are made from fused silica, in other words, glass. When working with glass capillaries, you will have residual silanols present along the surface of the capillary. Silanols will bind formidably with polar analytes. The hydroxyl group itself presents strong partial positive charges and strong partial negative charges towards analytes. The strong partial positive charge will have an affinity towards electronegative analytes, particularly neutralized bases. Likewise, the strong partial negative charge will have an affinity towards hydroxyl groups, particularly those associated with neutralized acids. Active sites are the primary cause of column failure. Be mindful of the construction of a wall-coated open-tube GC column, which we often refer to as a capillary column, or perhaps a capillary column, depending on your choice of pronunciation. The stationary phase coats the interior of the capillary, while a polyamide coating protects the exterior of the capillary. An active site occurs most often in the form of exposed residual silanols from worn-out patches of the stationary phase. The polarity of active sites will induce tailing and a loss of sensitivity among polar analytes. Oxygen in particular, along with moisture within the carrier gas, will damage the stationary phase to reveal the underlying silica surface. Continuous oxidation ultimately leads to irreversible bleed of the stationary phase film. Contact between the column and a hot GC oven wall will also damage the exterior of the column, leading to later loss of the stationary phase along the interior of the column. Another source of active sites is the accumulation of non-volatiles that may bind with analytes. Non-volatiles can accumulate from repeated solvent focusing steps during a method and during repeated on-column injections. These techniques on their own are perfectly fine and used regularly, but the user just needs to be mindful to regularly trim the ends of the column to remove this buildup. Let's review an example of an exhausted column whose active sites affect certain types of analytes differently. Polar analytes will tail and lose sensitivity, while nonpolar analytes are also at risk of exhibiting broad peak shapes and inconsistent retention times. All of these behaviors lead to a loss of efficiency, selectivity, and ultimately resolution. This example consists of nonpolar hydrocarbons, an alcohol, an acid in the form of a phenol, and a base. The polar analytes clearly tail and lose sensitivity. Some of the hydrocarbons appear to be unaffected, but the last hydrocarbon to elute during this analysis also suffers in the form of a broader peak and a later elution time. This ultimately compromises the efficiency of this particular peak. If the runtime of this method was 1.5 minutes, then we would not see this last peak at all, and it may appear as a ghost peak during subsequent samples. If this column behavior continued after replacing the inlet liner and the septa, then we can begin to confidently determine that this column may have exceeded its lifetime. There are other considerations with respect to your method conditions, such as your sample preparation or the agreement between the polarity of your analytes, solvent, and stationary phase. At Phenomenix, we can help you to navigate those other considerations. Abnormal baseline behavior is also a helpful guide by which to determine if a column can indeed be saved or if it has simply ceased to be. A downward trend when baking out a column actually indicates that there are just simply residual high boiling impurities within the column that are responding to the bakeout. This is very promising for the column and suggests that the column simply needs to be baked out for a longer period of time. Just be mindful of the maximum isothermal temperatures for a column during a bakeout. I often recommend to conduct your bakeout at a temperature of about 10 to 20 degrees Celsius below the maximum isothermal temperature, just to be on the safe side. A continuous upward trend during a bakeout suggests that the stationary phase is experiencing persistent bleed from long-term oxidation. Furthermore, you will need to check the gas traps and filters to make sure that the oxygen and moisture filters have not expired. A very large rise in the baseline during a temperature gradient is also a sign that stationary phase has been damaged from oxidation. Be mindful of the maximum temperature to which a column may be exposed during a gradient, as prolonged exposure to that maximum temperature or beyond will result in excessive loss of the stationary phase. To wrap up this brief presentation, be mindful of trends among the peaks within your sample. You may differentiate between system-wide problems and column-specific problems based on whether the adverse chromatography is universal among all the peaks or selective to specific peaks within your sample. Active sites are the common cause of GC column failure, and they may arise from exposed silanols and from the accumulation of non-volatiles within the column. Confidently make a decision about the column in the interest of your own time and energy. If you inspected the rest of your GC system, you have trimmed your column, and abnormal behaviors persist among select analytes, then your column may need to be replaced. We can help determine if other facets of your method need consideration, but be mindful that your column may have reached the end of its life. Lastly, use the performance of the baseline to determine if a column has been inherently compromised. Thank you very much again for your time.